Welcome to another edition of Beyond the Sermon. I'm Matt Hotho, the Director of Production and Online Engagement.
And I'm Magrey Vega, the Senior Pastor.
So Magrey, you just preached a sermon in our series, The Good Book, on troubling images of God in the Bible. So I thought before we get into the content of your sermon and some of the questions that it raises, let's do a quick recap just through the first 5 books of the Bible in some ways of how the Israelites, these ancient people, get to know God.
Sure.
Get to know Yahweh. Yeah.
Well, it goes back to the very first story as God the Creator, who first hovers as spirit. And then right away, we get this idea of a God who vocalizes, who can speak words, audible, and that every time God speaks, something happens. Either creation happens or God can speak directly to human beings. And that speaking God that can be heard audibly just changes everything in terms of the relationship with humanity. Abraham is called. God self-identifies to Moses in the burning bush. And then we get to these ideas of objects being experiential. So you have 10 commandments, you have a pillar of fire, you have a cloud. So God goes from being sort of an amorphous spirit to being an audible voice to all of a sudden having places and objects being representatives of God. And I think that may be one continuing way of looking at the Pentateuch.
Yeah, and God then becomes the one who starts giving order, whether through the sacrificial system or through the law,
yes,
right? Which then brings us to the end of the Pentateuch in Deuteronomy.
Absolutely.
So we get this kind of structure for who God is, and yet, despite that structure, God behaves in really unpredictable ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So those linchpins that we have in the way we experience God today as spirit and as voice and as experiential objects still give a lot of latitude, particularly to the Hebrew depictions of God as a God who is free, in some ways capricious, in some ways uncontrollable, beyond the understanding of human beings in the moment. And that's still a dimension of our theology today. We don't control God. We can't contain God. God in many ways is still capricious and free to be whoever God chooses to be. As I said in the sermon, that's an invitation for us to have our language keep up with who God is becoming for us in our relationship with God.
Yeah, and as we get to talking about who God is becoming in our relationship, let's talk about one of the ways that God is really hard to deal with in the Old Testament. And I think a general way to think about it is whether we're talking about the Noah story or even the weird interactions God has with Moses and other people is God doesn't like sin. Like sin makes God really uncomfortable in the Old Testament and in the New Testament in some ways, but in the Old Testament, and God will just go, oh, there's sin there? Wipe it out.
Yeah, that's a really good way of describing at the heart of what some of these most troubling images of God are. If there's a consistent theme, you're absolutely right. If there's a consistent theme among these most unsettling images of God, it is that God clearly has a right way and a wrong way, an intended way for things to be, and then the way that humans act instead.
Yeah.
And so from the Noah story on, that really is a continuing feature of God's character, isn't it?
Yeah. But something that's helpful to, because I think sometimes we can think about, okay, well then does that mean that God is legalistic? And I think that that's unhelpful for thinking about it. I think there's more this sense of, well, sin makes things messy, whatever that sin is, whether it's harming somebody or systemic evils. Those literally add a messiness to the world that has to be cleansed. I mean, that's the sacrificial system in Leviticus, right? I think that's what's at play in some of these times, like in, again, the Noah story, but also some of the things that the prophet says, where God's going to wipe the slate clean, is because the messiness is just so much. It's like that thing where like, oh, you spilled olive oil on the floor of your kitchen, just buy a new house.
Yeah.
It is a big mess, too much to clean up.
And I suspect that's why these stories remained in the Hebrew canon and the Christian canon, where editors later could have easily just whitewashed some of these troubling images of God and reconciled them with later depictions of God that we might be more familiar with. They kept them there for that reason, didn't they?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. You could always go back and edit out your story. We can edit our personal stories, right? I mean, there are probably things that we wouldn't want to testify to having happened in our past, right? But remembering them keeps us honest to who we are so that we don't go down that path again.
I will say that in my sermon for this week went through several revisions, and the last revision I made was this idea that expanding your box to accommodate the new depictions of God to meet the crisis of the moment. Here's the change I made. Also means that you can hold on to some of the prior images of God that may have seemed troubling, so that you could hold on to what was helpful in those images. And so my earliest image of God that I talked about, God as this menacing, muscular punisher who tried to keep me in line. I mean, I've jettisoned that judgmental character, condescending character of God, but I've still kept, my box is still big enough to hold on to the idea that God wants me to act the right way. In the moment. God still has this standard of what's intended for me and what is not intended for me. And that part of that image still needs to be in this even expanded box that I have.
Right. This idea that God, like maybe an early version of God that I would have had is, okay, if I pray, I get an A on this test. Right. Or if I pray to God, like maybe I'll, or if I got a B, was it because I didn't pray? Right. And we realize that no, God isn't the one that is, we have to do the work, right? If I'm unhappy with my mental health or with my marriage or with, my physical health, like that's not something to pray about, just pray about. Like you got to do the work, man. And you can't just sit around waiting for God to do the thing for you, right? But I think so many of us have that image of God and we don't grow up from that image of God.
That's right.
And so then when those things aren't working out for us, we blame God for our situation. So let's talk about expanding that box of God, right? We both have a similar story about ways that our boxes of God have been expanded critically at moments, actually in seminary for both of us. But let's back up a second and go through middle school, high school, college version of who God was for Magrey de Vega, and then maybe seminary version of who God was for Magrey de Vega.
Yeah. In those early formative years, God was definitely a personified figure in my envisioning, in my imagination, that I could imagine, I could picture someone with facial features that could interact with me within my own mind. And that was helpful to me, and still is to some degree in some cases. But it was in seminary and began in college, this whole idea that God is bigger than that. I remember reading the story of Elijah on Mount Horeb, where in that story, you may be familiar with it, Elijah's in a cave. God says, I'm going to pass by. And the first 3 experiences that Elijah had that echoed ways that Elijah had experienced God before, through a wind, through an earthquake, through a fire. I mean, these are all manifestations of God that were classic, iconic experiences of God all throughout the Hebrew Bible before that. God was not in any one of those. And I remember realizing that that was a challenge even to me, that even these images of God that I'd held on to in the past, God wasn't always in those. And it wasn't until Elijah opened his imagination to a still small voice, a non-personified, non-visible, non-visceral experience of God, a God who was more breath, more silence, more force, energy, more presence in the universe. That's when Elijah could experience God. That was a pivotal moment for me to begin looking at God in a more expansive way.
Yeah. I agree with that. God as something more than just a deal maker. God more than just someone that you just pray to that is forceful, but someone who can also act in more calm, quiet kind of ways.
And if I may say, it was during seminary that I went through some of my deepest existential crises. It was the first time I'd lived away from home, lived outside the state. I was having to go through all sorts of personal developmental issues of growing up into adulthood, trying to figure out my career path. I mean, I remember. And so in my sermon, when I said sometimes these theological expansions coincide with personal crises, I think we see that in the Bible, and certainly been true in my life.
Yeah. That's really helpful. So I'll say one place where my understanding of God expanded was my first class of seminary. One of my classmates just stands up and says, I am called to ministry and I'm gay. And that is who I am, and that is my identity, and God has called me to ministry. And I just remember just not knowing what to think, like being like, that doesn't make any sense. From what I had grown up thinking, it was just like, I don't think God does that. Does God? And or actually, that's what I said. Does he? You know? And I remember going to talk to that friend, or that person who would later become a friend afterwards, right? And just be like, tell me more about this calling, right? that curiosity that was like, okay, God is working in a way that I was not familiar with. And I know you had a similar experience, and unfortunately it was at a time when that person who experienced it was actually really scared as to what it would mean for their calling.
Right.
Thankfully,
Absolutely.
10 years ago, this person was in a place where it was safe for them to live out their calling as a gay man, wanting to be faithful to what God had called them to do. But it expanded my box of who God is. And I think we've all had experiences like that. Maybe if you're much older than Magrey and I, maybe it was actually when you had a really good interaction with someone who had different color skin than you. I know that sounds crazy to think about, but the 60s weren't that long ago. And I think we were expanding our understanding of what it meant to see God at work and people who didn't look like us, behave like us, love the same people we love. But God is at work in those people.
It's a connection I hadn't thought of. Every time there's a theological expansion of the way God is revealed in the Bible, there's a theological expansion of the hospitality and grace of God to more and more people. Those things really do go hand in hand.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of an Acts 15 moment where Peter receives this vision for there to be no such thing as clean and unclean and everybody's welcome would be an unfathomable idea to the spiritual ancestors in the Torah. And so it's an indication that when one's view of God expands, so does the implication of God's love for people in the world.
And to be fair to our Jewish brothers and sisters,
Absolutely.
especially today, and especially in the Reformed tradition,
Yes.
they would do that same work with the Torah
Yes.
to make the Torah, understand the Torah in a way that is life-giving and liberating to a broad expansion of
Which
people.
is an excellent bridge to a really important point, that all of us, many people, have different names for God, different views of God, different pronouns for God. And especially for people in our position as leaders in the church, we need to be able to connect to people wherever their current theology is without any kind of condescension. So a person who uses, just as an example, a person who uses primarily male images and pronouns for God versus a person who uses other kinds of pronouns or other kinds of images for God. Neither of them need to have one value judgment cast as more important or less than the other. The term I always go back to is that we ought to be theologically multilingual. Recognize that all of us are on a journey. God is revealed to us in ways that are resonant to us at the time, and none of us are static. We are always growing, expanding. So having that amount of grace and that kind of generous perspective on people is really important to allow us to be where we are in our journey with God.
I think that's a great place to end. I think that idea of being gracious towards other people, having a generous orthodoxy, a way that we are able to hold our understanding of who God is and be able to communicate with people who might hold a different understanding is huge. So thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Beyond the Sermon. We will be back next week as we continue our series, The Good Book. Till then, see you later.